Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by regular hosts Dr. Adam Francisco and Rod Rosenblatt. We are about halfway through May now, as of this episode's coming out. And so what that means is we're going to do a question and answers episode, which is kind of new to the show to do them this often, but has actually been really successful. I think we have a good time actually engaging with listeners. I think this was one of the struggles of the first 2 years of podcasting that wasn't as prevalent as it is now, because as we were growing listeners, we were getting questions, but they weren't as frequent. We get several a week now, serious questions that people I think deserve responses to. They listen to the show, they kind of are provoked by it to think of these questions, and so I really do feel like we have a duty to do this since we've kind of put these in their mind.
Sure.
And before, we maybe got enough questions to answer over email that it only became necessary to do question and answer episodes once a year, maybe once or twice a year. Well, now it's definitely to that point where this once a month is, I think, really helpful, because while we're not a live radio show, we can be more like a weekly kind of radio show, because we do still record it in advance. We have kind of complicated travel schedules between everybody's school, speaking events, and the like. So we're definitely still ahead of where listeners are. So like if you sent us a question upon hearing this episode, we're not going to get to it for another 3 or 4 weeks. But we're catching up to people. And so this week I have some really nice and short questions, but that I think will have filling answers, which is nice, because sometimes we have to wade through kind of paragraphs to find the meat of the question that I usually reduce on the show. So some people may not always recognize the question that they asked that I'm posting on these Q&A episodes, because I really try to get to the heart of matter and kind of chop it down so that it's good for the podcast format. But today we have a handful of great questions that I think we can help people out with. So we'll jump right into that now. Why not? So the first question came a couple weeks ago, and it's from a student who's going to be either is like in a freshman year of undergrad or will be a freshman in the upcoming year undergraduate. And he's already thinking ahead for kind of postgraduate, thinking about going to seminary and becoming a pastor. But his question has to do with, what should I pursue, or how can I prepare myself during undergraduate? I thought this was pretty interesting, because there's a basic answer you can give. You say, well, if you're thinking about being a Lutheran pastor and you're going to one of our undergraduate schools, there's pre-seminary programs that do what they can to prepare you. But I think there's probably maybe a better answer or a mixed answer here. So I'll open that to you guys.
Well, I'm going to give one that probably is not standard, but has held me in good stead. I was going to take over my father's surgical practice. So for 3 out of my 4 college years, I was doing nothing but the natural sciences, period. Others were in the humanities. I had no space to do that. Now, why do I recommend it? Well, if you're going to be doing any kind of apologetics, and Lord knows in our circles it's needed, we do not have seminary courses in apologetics. There was one 5-year period when Dr. Francisco was at our seminary in Fort Wayne, but that's the only time in 100 years in our circles that was done. Now, why do I mention that? Well, a rigorous year in physics or a rigorous year in inorganic or organic chemistry will in many ways prep you to do historical apologetics in a way that not even history will. You can take history in addition to. But in any of the natural sciences, you get used to inductive thinking. And you get used to probability reasoning because you have to in the lab. There's no avoiding it. And it changes the brain. The way that you approach things will forever, and I think to the good, be modified by having that background in physics or chem. So that will not be what others are going to tell you, but I want to be one voice in the conversation that says that. Don't flee math, physics, and chemistry during your undergraduate years. Make use of them, and I mean a year of one or the other. So that's what I would recommend, and you're not going to hear that from any SEM prof.
I think it's a good recommendation. To what you were saying, I think it kind of opens up the difference between, well, and maybe the lack of difference between faith and knowledge, and sort of that artificial gap that can be placed between those two, and gets you thinking.
We never bought that from St. Thomas Aquinas. You can't know and believe something at the same time.
Yeah.
We never bought that distinction, and I'm glad we didn't.
Adam,
You went to seminary for a brief period of time, so maybe you have a little something to say about this.
for a semester or a term. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what Dr. Rosenblatt said is really good advice, because the temptation is to go do your undergraduate degree in some sort of pre-seminary program where you're going to learn Greek and Hebrew and systematic theology and all these other things, and then you're going to go to seminary and do the same thing at a higher level, to be sure. But my experience was I was maybe over-prepared in the undergraduate level and just got bored immediately. But also, another thing to think about is thinking practically here, and it looks like more and more pastors are going to have to be sort of, what do they call it, tent makers, where they're going to, in addition to serving a church, they're going to have to work.
Yeah, churches are getting smaller, and budgets are getting smaller, which means paying a pastor full-time is
it's
being a challenge for some areas.
So, I mean, the real quick skinny for me is do what you're good at and what you like, what you want to know more about. Study something that you're inclined towards, not something necessarily that comes easy to you, but something you want to just really dive into just for the sake of diving into it. Science sounds like a great way to go. I would say if you're coming to Concordia Irvine, do history, but sure. I don't. But one thing, I'm not young anymore, but I remember growing up, Missouri Synod for the most part, and it was never explicit, and I don't think anybody ever intended this, but it was sort of assumed that if you're a male and you're interested in theology, in Missouri Synod, you will be a pastor.
Yep.
Yeah.
I get that out of your head. You can do any number of things and still be a faithful member of the church, and so I think long and short of it is do what you want.
Yeah.
I hope in our pre-sem curricula that we have breathing room for doing that.
So I was just
Germans want to organize everything, and in many ways, well, for instance, in my pre-med career, I had very little room for the humanities.
Yeah.
There just wasn't space to do it. And I hope we don't do the flip, and that is if you're assigning yourself to a pre-seminary course when you get there, everything is already laid out and you don't have any wiggle room whatever. That's not wise on
So
our part.
I can talk to this from probably the most recent experience. I was a pre-seminary student at Concordia Irvine. I didn't end up going to seminary for various reasons. Part of it being maybe a little rebellious nature of people like Dr. Francisco pointing out to the "you will be a pastor" type thing, which wasn't really my jam. But being in pre-seminary doesn't mean that you're necessarily a theology major, depending on which Concordia you're at. So Concordia Irvine, for instance, has a pre-seminary program that essentially functions as a minor, so you can pursue any other major at the university while being a pre-seminary student. A lot of them, myself included, were theology students. For me, that was because in reality, I wanted to pursue theology academically, and that's one of the reasons I chose not to go to seminary, but to do a traditional MA program in Europe. But you can do something else besides theology while doing pre-sem. Pre-sem program, at least at Irvine, I cannot speak specifically for the other Concordias, means that you'll study Greek and Hebrew and doctrine. And besides that, there's some other practical courses that they call them where they try to teach you about sort of the financial issues that you may be getting yourself into with taking a call and things like that. But the other thing I was going to say is if you're asking this question because you think your theological knowledge is wanting before going to undergrad and then you're going to seminary, I wouldn't worry about that too much. The theological education at the undergrad Concordias and the seminaries, from what I hear, mirror each other fairly closely. And so you could come in having taken doctrine courses and the Old and New Testament courses that every student has taken at Concordia Irvine with maybe a little more individual reading that's perhaps guided by things like this show or other resources online to catch you up would be adequate. If there's something else you want to pursue, like Dr. Francisco said, do something that you're good at.
Yeah, and if you're 18, 19 years old, you might change your mind too.
Sure.
Right.
So, keep the options open.
Cool. Yeah.
Study hard. Dive right into whatever it is you're
whatever you like
studying.
doing, just take it to heart and let it matter. I think that's one of the number one complaints professors will have about students nowadays is that they just don't care about anything, even the things that they say that they're really into. So if you really are going to pursue this, just pursue it to the best of your ability. Actually read, actually write, actually think about things. So cool. I think that's a pretty good start to this episode. The second question that we have for this episode that we'll do before the break is we have a listener who is, I don't want to say having problems at church, but wants to approach his pastor about preaching. He says that he loves the church that he's at, that the pastor is, kind, friendly, all those kind of things, but that he rarely preaches Christ, but will sometimes preach about Christ. And he wants to know, he doesn't want to abandon ship. He said this is about the fourth Lutheran church that he's been to where these kind of preaching problems, I don't know, this is happening. And he's settled here. His family's here. There aren't other issues to speak of, but how does he kindly approach him and say, you're preaching about Christ, not preaching Christ?
Boy, that's a tough one. Because in almost every case, the pastor imagines that he is preaching Christ. Now, I didn't take my homiletics at the Missouri Synod level, so there I'll have to defer to others. I am curious as to what approach is taken at either one of our two seminaries, but that's all, it's just curiosity. I know how easy it is to fall back on what you grew up with. That every homiletics prof meets that in every single student. The default position is going back to what you were raised in. But that's a problem, not an answer usually. It is worth asking, if you're Lutheran, it's worth asking others about this. The way to approach it psychologically, I think I can't be of much help with. Just be civilized and make sure it comes across as a question rather than a hidden
Telling you what to do.
Yes, that's tough, but it's the assignment here to do it by asking what it is that his training was. And listen to the answer. It could be that what he's needing was never part of that pastor's training. That's conceivable and maybe even probable. I don't know in Missouri Synod circles. As I said, I don't know what is do or die in homiletics at either place. But if we don't recognize what it is in our homiletics courses to actually placard Christ in his saving office, Christ in his dying and rising for you, then we need to learn it in a heck of a hurry.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to give away too much, but 1517 is working on a project that is going to be a resource for pastors that actually has involvement from professors at both seminaries.
Good.
That in work is communication, but also there will be some examples of handling the text to see Christ's work in the weekly readings.
Good.
In the lectionaries and things like that. So there's kind of resources going through that. Piggybacking on Dr. Rosenblatt, I think there's only a couple suggestions I would have. One, have you talked to him about other things, your pastor about other things? Have you befriended him in any other way? Is this the first formal conversation you'll ever have with that pastor?
Right.
I think that's a good place to start. Perhaps talk about other things, go out to lunch, engage with as many of the other happenings at that church that you have going on. Because kind of a question or out of the blue might catch him by surprise if you've never had a friendly conversation with him before.
Good suggestion.
And I think that's maybe one of the ways that the issue might be able to come up organically, too. If you're obviously interested in theology and you can recognize this, maybe read with him, maybe see, does he go through the text before he writes sermons on it? Would he be willing to sit down with you and go through the text with you?
Sure.
There's all sorts of types of things there, and then just be as cordial as you can.
Mm-hmm. And don't assume you're right.
That's right. Yeah, maybe you're wrong. Yeah. Bring up examples, bring up the sermon in question, and maybe you were wrong. That's a good ad. So, yeah, I don't have personally much experience with this. I'm pretty young, and I've only really been a member at 3 different churches. So, and I think thankfully have been blessed by good preaching for the most part, and by involvement of my family and things like board of elders and things like that. Where
the other thing that I think of is I'm in Orange County, California. Within driving distance of me are 3 or 4, maybe 5 solidly Missouri preaching churches. I have a lot of choice, but I have to stop and think, what if I were in Chicken Breath, Nebraska?
Yeah, and there's nothing for 50 more miles. No.
Yeah, you'd have to drive 2 hours to another one.
I used this Chicken Breath in Nebraska reference in Nebraska once, and they looked at me cross-eyed.
Yeah, and I think you would just handle this the way you would handle anything, even that it wasn't about this particular issue, right? If you aren't involved in that church and you've just been sitting in the back pew, I don't think this is going to go over as well as somebody who's maybe, sort of an invested member almost. Mm-hmm. You've been there, your family's been there, the pastor on a personal level. Mm-hmm. You're involved. I think that's probably the first step. But that's good. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then we have a couple more questions that we can throw on the back end of this episode. Hey there, and welcome to our break. Hey, I know that I spent a lot of time talking about this in the last month, but it's because it's such a big deal for us. I'm going to talk about the 1517 Legacy Podcasting Network now. This is really important because what we've managed to do is kind of combine the force of audio projects that have been around in some cases for 4 or 5 years, and put them all together in a very easily accessible way via the 1517 website, via iTunes, any of the podcasting apps, and make them so they're identifiable, they have a common goal, and that way we can give listeners more things every week. One of the things with the network that I just realized is that every week now, the 1517 Podcast Network is putting out around 10 hours of new audio content every week. It's not recycled. It's not old stuff that we're doing. That is genuine new recordings every week. So if you're only listening to the Thinking Fellows, you're only getting about an hour of what's available. And so if you're interested in hearing more, I know some listeners probably get enough theology for the week out of our show, but if you're interested in more, especially the intersection of theology and faith with different areas, we have a lot of shows to offer. So 1517legacy.com/podcasts is where you can go to see all of the collections. Alternatively, you can open up iTunes, and if you search 1517 podcasts, all 8 of our current shows show up in a pretty little line, so that you can kind of click and choose. Between them, archived, there's something like, I want to say like 600 episodes of shows that are around an hour long. So that's Thinking Fellows, Virtue in the Wasteland, 30 Minutes in the New Testament, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, Let the Bird Fly, Banned Books, You Are Forgiven, and Ringside. These are Christ-centered podcasts. Every single one covers different topic material. We have exegetical podcasts with 30 minutes in the New Testament, 40 minutes in the Old Testament. We have theological podcasts that deal with doctrine, church matters, history, apologetics with Thinking Fellows, Let the Bird Fly. Banned Books is doing conversation around provoking topics found in books from Christian authors. So they've done like 3 episodes dealing with kind of ideas that come out of reading C.S. Lewis' Introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation. They're the most recent show on the podcast, so they only have 4 or 5 episodes as of this airing. So if you want to get in early on the ground level on a podcast, you can go check that out, Banned Books. You Are Forgiven is the preaching arm of 1517. We gather sermons that are focused on Christ's proclamation, the proclamation of Christ's death and resurrection for you there. Ringside does 3-minute bits of different information of airtime, so that's really unique as well. So yeah, go check that out, 1517legacy.com/podcast. If you have found these podcasts as of value to you, we don't charge for any of this content. And like I said, this is 10 plus hours a week of available audio content. We get all of our support right now from donations from listeners of these shows. So if you have been impacted by the Thinking Fellows or any of this other content, if you want to support the expansion of our podcasting arm, go ahead and click the donate button in the top right-hand corner of the 1517 website or the Thinking Fellows website. There you can say why you're donating. There's a note. You can select whatever amount. There's no limit where I'm not asking for, big amounts here. So yeah, please consider supporting 1517 in its podcasting endeavors. And, the real goal here is conversations about Christ. So thank you. Okay. So we have, half a show to fill here, and we have a couple more questions. I got an interesting one, because we don't often get questions about the interaction between Lutherans and Anglicans, but this one is basically asking, it's a listener who is an Anglican in a church. I don't know what the acronym stands for. I'm only familiar with Lutheran acronyms, but ACNA, Anglican Church, which is in fellowship with the NALC, the North American Lutheran Church. And so he's been to some of the Lutheran services. He's an Anglican, so he's sitting here and he listens to our podcast and other things, and he's wondering, okay, what's the deal? What's the big difference between us? I'm not seeing a ton.
I can put one thing into the mix, but Dr. Francisco will know much more on this than I. When the earliest thinkers in the Church of England were meeting together at the White Horse Inn, Cambridge, to read Luther and Luther's stuff, they were charged with designing the Reformation in England, in the context of the Church of England. And they drew it up, and all sorts of furor happened because what the Church of England said was, this is nothing but the Augsburg Confession.
Yeah.
And it was. It was Lutheranism. It was the Augsburg Confession. And it got killed very early in the game. But in their earliest years of forming the Reformation in the Church of England, that was the true background. They came with their suggestions and got criticized. Somebody said, this is just Lutheranism.
Yeah. We had this is going back 2 years, maybe more. Corey Moss was on on covering Robert Barnes.
Yes, the
He was
martyr.
an English Lutheran martyr in the early days of the English Reformation. Yeah, where we cover that history.
We also
And-
recently did an episode on Cranmer.
Cranmer, yeah, and there is that's the I don't know if it's the genius of Anglicanism or something else.
Yeah.
But you can be really Lutheran in the Anglican communion. You can be very
Oh, yeah.
you can be very high church Catholic and not even really be a theist.
Yep.
And still fit.
Yep.
So
Broad church in the dark side of broad.
I was once given a tour by an Anglican, they call it an ordinand, a seminarian in Oxford, and we walked perpendicularly from Broad Street to High Street. And as we're walking there, we passed, there's where John Wycliffe went to college, Jesus College, and the ordinand was really sharp and witty. He says, "Here we are walking from Broad to High Street, passing Jesus along the way, just like the Anglican Church."
Yeah, there is room for everybody in the Anglican Church. You had everything from people who were indiscernible from Roman Catholic through to strongly Reformed, Packer
Yeah.
and others of his ilk. You had a whole evangelical wing, John Stott, and then you had people that you wondered whether they were even theists.
Yeah.
And all of it fits under the banner of the Church of England. All of it.
Yeah, it's not confessional in the same way
No.
that Lutheranism is. We would say that with Lutherans, if somebody saying that they're Lutheran, there's sort of a litmus test available to say you either are.
There is one in the Anglican Church. It's called the 39 Articles.
Yeah.
If your priest holds to the 39 Articles, that's a pretty Reformation confession.
Yeah. And so there is that definitely, and so
And can I say something that probably will get me in trouble?
go for it.
If you're Anglican and you go to a church and your priest, I guess they'd call it, is preaching Christ crucified and the doctrine is sound, God be praised.
Yes, absolutely.
That's right. So yeah, so in fact, so you might be at an Anglican church that definitely shares Lutheran theology because of the way it's centered. In my experience, the only differences I've really seen with like Reformational Anglicans is sometimes sacraments, and in that, perhaps even just the way we describe them, not necessarily what we believe is happening there. So it depends. That one's hard. It depends church to church, but we could say that about Lutherans too. I mean, you could show up at a church and theoretically, this is what should be being taught / preached there, and very often that's not the case. And so I would say that's the same.
Well, it's
Similar boat.
it's not as intense in our circles, but to believe, as I used to believe 25 years ago, that I could tell people, go to Lutheran in your yellow pages in the phone book, then find Missouri Lutheran, then go there, and I'll tell you exactly the page he's going to begin on and what he's going to end with, because they will be operating with our hymnal. That's not true anymore.
Yeah, more often than not true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got so many fun stories about the Anglican Church. I could I remember on it was either Easter or Christmas, where I don't know if they called it divine service, but it was their morning service, and we were bouncing. My wife and I walked out with their beach balls around during the service, and they're having some sort of quiz. So.
Yeah.
But I've also been to some really great ones too. So there's nothing like an evensong at an Anglican church in England.
Yeah, the one Christmas Eve service that you can get on DVD. Now there's no sermon, which is interesting. It's all scripture and carols.
Yeah.
But it is magnificent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's and perhaps that kind of leads into there's a definitely, not always, but definitely a bigger focus on liturgy sometimes.
Yes.
There's where in the Lutheran tradition there's probably a heavier focus on preaching.
Yes.
With liturgy supporting the preaching and directing you towards the sacraments, that is Christ being delivered to you, whereas in the Anglican tradition there's a higher focus on the liturgy,
Yeah.
sort of protecting preaching.
One of your colleagues was doing a PhD in Scotland, and his tutor there said, "You're probably the only Lutheran on Scottish soil." And he wrote to me and said, "What are we to do?" And I said, "Well, go to the Anglican church and take your gadget with you. And then when the unbelieving priest gets into the pulpit, put your earbuds in and listen to Nagel preaching Christ and smile as if you're listening." But, that's on the edges counsel, What do I do? Well, the liturgy is still intact there. There are things he has to say, even things absolving you that he has to say. But if you're betting on the pulpit, no, don't bet on the pulpit.
Yeah. So again, case by case in those types of situations. I think what'll end up perhaps being the final question, maybe we'll have one time for a more just relaxed question from me at the end, is a question about confirmation. So this is, a question to Lutherans. So it sounds like this person comes out of a Baptist tradition, but their question is Lutheran confirmation the same thing as the Baptist public confession of faith? These are both public. They seem to both be about joining the church as a member. What is the difference in teaching or purpose between these two types of things?
Well, the function of catechism in a Lutheran setting is educational more than it is conversion. The altar call in any Baptist church is headed for conversion, and ours is not in that same sense. The function of catechism in any Lutheran context is educational, and it is not aimed at conversion of sinners. It is to teach in detail one of the Luther's small catechism, one of the books that's included in our Book of Concord, and to teach that to the students well in a particular way. That is, how Christ's person and work actually saved them, and the benefits of it were given to them by their Trinitarian baptism. Mm-hmm. And then to work from that, it's different from the altar call.
Yeah, I think part of it is
A little.
Yeah.
carrying on the tradition of the Reformation. If you read the preface to Luther's catechisms, there was a big issue with people not knowing anything at all about Christianity. And so
That's right.
What catechesis does is essentially says we're not going to take for granted the fact that you've been in this church for the last 10, 12 years, if you've done that. We're going to actually see what you've been taught, perhaps in Sunday school or from the pulpit, and we're going to teach you the basics of Christian doctrine and teaching.
Yep.
So that you're, in one sense, prepared. You know what should be there, perhaps, in the church. You know what you're receiving. You know that you have forgiveness in Christ. You know what the law is. You know what the gospel is. You can identify those parts of what's happening in church. Which is probably why it waits till later, and then say doing it, confirming a 5-year-old or something like that.
Sure.
It's, at a point in their education where they can critically think.
A little,
Yeah.
And there's another thing about this. If adults say, teach me what Lutheran theology is in 15 minutes, the response to that is probably try Luther's catechism. That's the entryway point. It's the simplest. It's not long. It's one of the great books of the Western world. You will get a good sort of intro to who we are just with Luther's small catechism. And I can say that without worry. It does that. Yeah. You'll like it and resonate with it, or you won't.
Yeah. I have a 13-year-old in catechism right now, or confirmation, and he's typical 13-year-old boy
Sure.
resisting everything. And
Sure.
it's interesting. Every once in a while, when nobody's looking, you'll just catch him reciting the creed in church. But once you look, no
done.
more,
Yeah.
because it's sort of
Yep.
it's being put into his head.
Yep. And even if the child at that age still isn't seeing much of the detail of that, most people who are familiar with the trivium or the quadrivium know that this is the basics, and understanding of it in any depth will come later. But first of all, you got to put the basics in to the point of memorizing them.
Yeah, and so I would say if to the person asking this question, if it sounds like maybe you've witnessed some confirmation Sundays, where this maybe doesn't come off as education, but comes off more like an altar call. It might not be being done in the way that catechesis and confirmation is historically meant to function as. Because I mean, that's definitely the case. We never come on this show and say every Lutheran church does everything right historically, or Christian or Orthodox or any way. We often say things are kind of by a case-by-case basis, and what we
Parish by parish.
yeah, that's right. And what we try to do on the show is historical Orthodox Christianity, Lutheran doctrine. And so if what you're hearing on the show seems to conflict with what you're seeing in real life, that's a real possibility.
Sure.
And we may be wrong sometimes too, right? That's
Sure.
That's part
But
of
we're
the
going to try and be on the side of historic evangelische Lutheranism, Book of Concord stuff.
Yeah, which brings me back to the book one of the purposes of the book recommendation episode we did, and why most of the show notes tend to have books in them, is we tend to try to point people to sources outside of ourselves.
Sure.
Well, where did you get this, sprinkle of wisdom that you're trying to offer? Well, Small Catechism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Book of Concord. Well, a whole host. If you go look at the book recommendation episode, there's 70 books in there, and that doesn't even scratch the tip of the iceberg of everything we've ever recommended on this show.
Sure.
So, that's kind of the point. So, thank you for asking these great questions to all the listeners out there who have been sending these. It's really nice to interact with people who listen to the show and see what this makes them think of. What I am seeing a trend in is sort of what I just touched on, is people seeing a difference of what they hear on the show or then read later after, and then what they see in practice. And that's kind of one of the results of getting educated theologically, is that you'll kind of see when things are misaligned.
One hopes.
Yeah, and I think that was huge part of the Reformation, was educating lay. Again, to go back to the catechisms. Luther identified an education problem in the church, and that was a lot of what he went after.
Yeah, the visitation shocked him and the others at the low level of knowledge of even basic Christian things. And they were shocked. There was no understanding anywhere, it looked like.
Yeah. And so that's, I think what these questions are telling me is that we're actually having success in kind of replicating that mindset on the show. So please, keep that feedback coming, keep the questions coming as much as we can. We're going to continue to do this every month. And I think it's helpful. If you are finding these not helpful for any reason, maybe let me know. Tell me.
Sure.
We don't mind critiques. So you can always send an email. There's a contact button at the Thinking Fellows website. You can always drop us a line there. Thank you for listening to this show. You can catch us every week by subscribing on your favorite podcasting app, whether that is the iTunes podcasting app on an iPhone. You can also get various third-party apps that are perhaps better at it or easier to use. There's Overcast, Podcast Addict, Stitcher, and a couple more. So wherever podcasts are found, you can subscribe to the show. It's Thinking Fellows. It's bright yellow logo. You probably know that if you're listening to this right now. But we'll catch you next time.